Good morning. So it's Saturday. I try to do my videos every Saturday morning. Sometimes it's a specific job that I talk about. Sometimes it's an accumulation. But I always try to have a lesson of some sort. I try to give you some sort of a teaching moment about trees and tree care. Well, if you love trees, and I think most of you that are watching this channel do, I really hope you watch this video all the way to the end, because there's going to be an assortment of different topics, different things, and there's going to be some pretty cool stuff in here. So stick with me. I know it's a longer video, and I think you're going to like it. So this week's video is going to be kind of a collection, but I think you're going to like it. I got a lot of interesting things that happened this week. Please subscribe if you're not subscribed to my channel. Hit the like button, you know the routine. I appreciate it. And on with the show. The sounds of the forest. Absolutely love it when there aren't any mechanical sounds or sounds of man. But you have to really stop and tune in to all the subtle sounds. We live in a mechanized world that is constantly being overshadowed by the sounds of vehicles or aircraft or machinery of some sort. So to hear the silence of the forest and listening to the birds and all the subtle sounds of the trees moving in the wind, I work high in the sky above the homes and the residences of the people who live here in this part of our city. And I can see the trees interspersed with all the buildings and how important the trees are to the environments. And it's kind of interesting to look at the diversity of trees, everything from palm trees to, look at that giant that sticks up out there. Is that a redwood? Or a fir, likely a redwood. And way off in the distance there's another giant. There's a few tall trees, but mostly, smaller ornamentals that are wide spreading. There's trees that are very messy and trees that are declining. I mean, it is an ecosystem of life and death. Trees evolve, trees decline. Trees are constantly being manipulated by people. People are shaping them. People are making them fit their environment. It's like the trees that we're working on now. It's two southern magnolia trees that are not getting near enough water. They're too sparse. This tree has some sort of a leaf disease. I'm not sure what it is, but there's a lot of decline in it. We've got an absolutely gorgeous Japanese maple down below me here. There we go. Let's zoom out and get a little better perspective. There's a eucalyptus tree in the wires, so it's half of a tree. it's being constantly manipulated by the power company. It's a pretty good sized sycamore over there. The Japanese maple. Looks like another eucalyptus over in the distance there. So choosing the right species of tree for the right location has always been something that has perplexed people. They oftentimes will leave it up to the landscape designers to come up with trees that will fit. But more often the decisions are made based upon, a pretty tree or a useful tree. And more often than not, too many trees are planted in the space where maybe one tree should be planted and people will plant 3 or 4. So all the trees end up being inferior. So today's primary topic is going to be on wounds in trees and what happened and how to make the wounds better. Talking about branch bark ridge and preserving the collar of the cuts is very, very important. But I'm not going to just stick with the one topic. I'm going to break this video up into other little bits of interesting things that happened, and hopefully I'll keep you interested. There's a cut that I started, and there's the cleaned up portion of the cut. You want to leave enough of the collar so that it doesn't end up looking like that previous wound. Sometimes the tree decisions that we have to make are not very comfortable, and it's pretty clear that this is in pretty bad shape and this is really thin, but all of this out here is connected to this weakness. So should I leave that hoping that it's going to curl and get strong enough to keep that out there? Maybe. Or should I cut it off all the way down to here? There's a lot of decay down here, and this is also associated with it, and that decay may spread down into this part. So what do I do? Well, pretty clearly I've got to take this one off. That one's a goner. Let me take it in the first step and let's see what it looks like. All right, so this is what I did. There's some active tissue down here, there's some active tissue here. This is all rotting, but maybe if this grows up around, it'll keep this thing going. It's a big what if. Worst case scenario is we'll have to take the whole thing off down to here, but for now, I'm gonna leave it and I'll explain it to them. You can't always get everything right. You've got to do the best you can with every situation. And this is a weird one. The guy at this last job had a car parked under the tree. It was under a car cover, and he pulled the car cover off, and I just had to show you this. It's a V12, Jaguar V12, 1989. He said it was the last year they made the V12. Oh, such a beautiful car. Can't believe he doesn't keep it in a garage. This is also another interesting little bit. This was an old yew tree that was cut down to a stump, and the stump had finally died. There was still a little bit of life on it. The guy said, just cut that down. And I thought, we don't run into yew trees, that's YEW, very often. And the yew tree is a beautiful wood, but it's also got an interesting characteristic. This is the tree that the early English longbows, the best bows from early days, was made out of. I don't know if I can get any bow stock out of here, but I'm certainly going to do what I can with it. It turned out to be beautiful wood. Now I want you to take close notice of this wound on this Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak, and tell me what you think. My thoughts are that this wound was cut off a long time ago and the final cut ripped at the bottom. It's a flush cut, and look what happens. A flush cut leads to extreme internal decay. there's actually a waterfall-like effect of ants pouring out of here. They were pouring off the tree. They were falling on the ground. Had I been in the tree when this happened, I would be covered with ants. I'd be bit everywhere. And as it was, even keeping my distance, I was getting bit. They were climbing up my leg. I put the saw in there to see how deep it was, and sure enough, they climbed all over me. Now this next little bit here was kind of interesting. I saw these box elder beetles that were, well, I guess they're mating, and it looks like looks a bit like a bug orgy down here. Now on another job that I was at, the client asked me about these fairly new plantings. A landscaper came in, put in these 2 young ones, and did a horrible job of planting them. These are purple leaf flowering plums. And there was a third one back over here that was a little bit older, and it was right in the walkway. And he told me just cut them all down. But he was leaving the job up to me, so I decided to take out the 2 inferior trees and maybe prune this one up. Hopefully it'll become a little bit higher. You can always cut it down, but you can't put it back. So I'm hesitating on the 1 tree right here. So I dug them out, and in doing so, you can see that these were root-bound containers that were put in the ground, and they would never really evolve into, viable trees, when you do that. So I cut them off, I saved the trunks, and this was where there was a stake on the one. You could see the damage on it. And there were nice straight trunks. I thought, that'd be a shame to just throw those away. So I'm putting them in my walking stick collection for future work. Real pretty wood, real purple wood. So I'm going to put that on in the wood shop and get around to it. I'm using my camera, and I'm doing some close-ups here. I'm not going to get into it now, but you can see how if I put it on a tripod, this would be really valuable. And one of these days I'm going to do a video on chainsaw sharpening and really get in there and talk about it close. This is a tooth after I've sharpened it, but you can't really tell. So this is really the main topic that I really wanted to talk about in this video, and that's learning how to see a tree and see what's happened to it in the past, and recognizing that all of these wounds and everything that impacts a tree is pretty much permanent. It doesn't heal. Trees absorb wounds or they grow around them, but they don't heal. Very different than people. So it's a lot of times you can look at a tree and see things like those spur marks. And I've been working on this particular property for about 40 years. So the impact from those spur marks it predates me. Somebody from a long time ago got up in this tree with spurs on, and it's interesting that every tree tells a story if you know how to look at it closely and see what happened in the past. Here's a spot where somebody was readjusting themselves, and they spurred it and spurred it and spurred it and spurred it. And look at all those marks in the same spot. He was trying to get himself situated, and finally he got his foot up higher, and you can see where he made an old wound. Look at that. It's completely absorbed. You can't see the wound anymore. But what's going on inside there? Is that a flesh cut? Is that a deeper cut? And everywhere you look in these trees are the impacts from, spur marks from maybe 45, 50 years ago. And they show themselves for a long, long time. Sometimes they lead to spots of decay. Sometimes they lead to bigger problems. Here's an interesting shot. I want you to look at this close. This was a flesh cut that is trying to absorb it. But look at the chainsaw wound. They screwed up and they missed. So that tells me somebody was flying around the tree and just reaching over with one hand and making a really quick haphazard cut without much thought. And years ago, that was quite common. That's where he spurred into it and kind of reached over. I'm sure he was tied in up high and he was leaning over. It was probably really awkward. You know, he made the cut real quick and swung over to another spot and worked his way through the tree. But all of these oak trees are full of large wounds that are decaying. And the long-term impact from these wounds leads to hollows. This was another flesh cut. I don't know exactly how deep it is, but this part of the tree is now seriously compromised. I talk about flesh cuts and I talk about retaining the branch bark collar quite a bit. So here's a branch that died and I have to take it off. The bottom part was still fresh and green. So this is the cut that I made. Note that I try to make the smallest diameter cut that I can without it being a stub. Here's one that was a flesh cut from a long time ago, and you can see it's quite hollow. And that hollowing goes up above the cut and down through the system of the trunk or the tree. So, getting back to the cuts that I'm making. All right, here is another cut, and here it's cleaned up. I made it as small as I possibly could without it being a really pronounced stub. And a lot of people will look at this and they'll look up and say, well, cut it as close as you can because it looks better. Well, if you look at it close here from the ground, it kind of looks like a stub. But I retained the branch bark collar and the branch bark ridge. If I had gone back any further, then the wound gets larger and larger and larger. Here's another example of an old wound that has led to long-term problems. So if you learned anything from my videos, learn how to look closely at trees and recognize that what you do to a tree impacts that tree for the rest of its life. And if you make a bad decision, it can lead to the eventual decline or death of the tree. Hey, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the last little bit of the video here.